Sorry, just let me take a hot sec. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Okay. Where's this being streamed? Oh, there's the camera. I was like, where?
It's everyone's with them at home.
Okay. Oh. Okay. Hi, world. But okay. So, cool. Beginning speech in the first word. Obviously, consent is still applicable. Cool, let's 4th OG real quick. They have no idea as to how this money trickles back to the country. They actually don't give any counterfactual as to how this happens. They just say that there's an increase in efficiency. Somehow that efficiency, when this increase in profits are likely to go back to those companies anyway, is meant to trickle down. The only thing we get is job creation. We think that we can outweigh job creation if we can prove that we get longer term money, because that money can be funneled into broader sectors of the economy, affecting more people. I have no idea what their model is. Let's then understand essentially why this is also not going to have the level of control and oversight that they do. Let's note that this in itself is contingent for most of their case to work and in how they mitigate their harms. How do they tell us that there's likely to be some level of control? They state firstly that there's likely to be some level of competition. Why is this not necessarily true given their own framing? They frame that this is a new industry. This means that one, there's not as many professionals that you have who understand the technology that exists. They frame that this is expensive new technology. This means that it also takes a large amount of high startup costs, meaning in order to afford that technology. They cannot say this, yet also consistently claim that there are a large amount of companies who are able to compete for this level in order to own these mines. It's likely that you're going to have few companies which are able to actually go into these countries, purchase a license is what I assume their model is, and be able to also shunt out the startup costs of necessarily affording those new technologies and going in. What that means is that you're likely then have a race to the bottom at the point at which you have another country which is also willing to do that same thing, and in order to compete and give them lesser permissions, less oversight to make it a more attractive option for them to go in. I don't understand why they get accountability. Next, let's also just understand that at the point at which there's too much accountability, it just becomes less profitable for those companies to go in, right? Like, I think that this is just intuitive. Like, if you are cutting into their profit margins to the point where they're not likely to make as much money, I'm uncertain why there's still an incentive for those companies to exist. This means that the most likely model is where there is less oversight on those companies. Let's also then address their counterfactual and why it's necessarily not necessarily as true as they want to claim. First thing, why is it in itself efficiency is not necessarily as important? Because if they don't prove that efficiency actually trickles down to better means for people on the ground, I don't understand why, but also we give long-term longevity which will outweigh it. But two, I also think that they just blatantly lie here, right? A lot of countries like African continents have made and historically based their GDP around mining and extraction. Why is this important? Because when it comes to things like new technology, if anything, they're in a better position to transition because you already, one, have control of most of the mining operations. Two, you have existing relationships. Three, you can also just go and import things like technology because that's only an initial cost rather than a continuing one. We think it's very possible in order for them to be able to make a pivot towards extracting new things. It's on the gov burden to show why that technology is so radically different that they can't. They haven't done that. Then let's also just talk about why nationalization is better. We think that we also just better, like we don't think a monopoly is inherently bad. Let's go as to why control over the market is important. Before I move on, let's take from closing.
Okay, so I'm a Western solar panel company that needs lithium to produce solar panels. If I can't get them from resource-rich nations, what do I do next? If I can't get them consensually, what do I do next?
What do you mean you can't get them consensually? Presumably you have to buy them on our side? Like that happens on either side? Like, you still need the solar panels. They have to buy from someone. Let's then understand why you're likely then to control the outflow of materials at the point at which developing countries have some level who exist or at the point at which they can control extraction. First thing, things like cartelization and having to be able to commit cartel behaviors. I know it's a bad word, but hear me out. It's actually quite good in this instance for these countries. Things like moving with other states and working together and coordinating things, like removing the ability for those countries to like buy things at lower prices because you refuse to consistently lower those prices together. This means you're able to do things like make sure that you're not priced out, or that limits a race to the bottom argument that you might get for pricing that you might get from side government. Because most of the time when these states operate, there is some level of communication where people agree that this is a sub-level or a level of price which you're not willing to go under. Note that that can't happen at the point at which you don't control the extraction and therefore don't control the exports. We think that that in itself is a pretty intuitive premise. But then let's also then move on into controlling the flow of the market and why it's important. Because you're also then able to better adapt during things like crisis. So when you face instances where maybe there's like a lower demand, or there's a sudden low shock during like COVID might happen, you're able to cross-subsidize some other industries within government rather than risk a company pulling out and creating lasting damage to your ability to profit from those mines. I don't understand why that's necessarily something we shouldn't care about as to government side. We think that having control, having to keep those industries like afloat and keep it profitable during those times of crisis is important to your economic viability, considering like this is the main economic export of those nations. Then let's understand necessarily why we just get more net money and why this is still likely to be efficient. One, like let's understand like countries themselves have an incentive to control their product and to control the fluctuations that happen within their trade routes, right? This is why necessarily Saudi Arabia's nationalized oil, and they've been very good at it, right? Because they know that if you have control over those oil exports, you're able to avoid things like sudden shocks and like independent and unreliability of companies. Why that then becomes important is because in comparison, we think that things like one, productivity is probably necessarily bad in the short term for two reasons. These companies themselves often move to like extract the most amount possible in order to get their money back from those high startup costs. What does that look like? It looks like one, these are finite resources, right? Meaning that the amount that you have just slowly dwindles over time. Why is this not enough of a disincentive for the companies to stop doing it? Because when you're a large multinational, you can move towards other countries after one well has dried up. Another country or a government necessarily is forced to do something like ration it off, or because in order to maintain consistent viability. Secondly, let's note like environmental harms fucking happen, right? What is the OG mechanism and why doesn't it work in this debate? They say, no, people have international oversight. Panel, people, like, I know everyone says this, but like people know Nike sweatshops exist. They still do it and still buy from Nike. We haven't seen a large buyout. Like most of the time when something doesn't affect the consumer directly, they're not asked enough to care. But two, let's also then note that if anything comparatively, backlash is a lot easier to weaponize when it comes to things like a voting base rather than backlash of like someone in a different nation where you're fighting things like having to actually show a difference in profit margin. It's much easier to show that you care about things like environmental damage causing mudslides when you're able, or when that directly impacts your ability to gain support and maintain stability in the country. Thirdly, why are they managed well and why is corruption not an important part of this debate? Because note that what happens here is that this is given that this is the main export most of the time of those countries and how they base their economies, any form of inefficiency or instability in that directly reflects mostly on the quality of life of individuals. Looks like your government's ability to subsidize and finance most of its things like repair potholes if your manufacturing industry and your exporting industry suffers. This creates a disincentive for government to manage that poorly or to do things such as to harm it terrifically. It's actually better to maintain support as a government at the point at which your SOEs, particularly your state-dependent SOEs, function properly. We think that only happens on side opposition. Please side with R.
We can see leader of opposition invite the PM.
Okay. I want to begin by bringing back our analysis on competition, because I think the way that Lwando dealt with it was by pointing out the things that we said don't happen and the reasons that we give you. And I want to point out the implication of competition on this round, but try to win any ways and engage on their best case and show why even if we have monopolies, it is much preferable to the nationalization that they seem to defend on opening opposition. Why did we say competition happens? And this is in response to them saying there's high startup costs and it's a new industry. Firstly, the high startup costs, unlike, for example, with long-term energy in the past have been heavily mitigated because of the heavy desire for the production of these technologies in developed countries right now. That means investment into sustainable technologies. That means subsidization from the government. That means startup costs have been heavily mitigated, which has led to competition. Second, and this is just empirically true, right? Presumably the largest actor in this debate is the USA. The FTC has been super stringent in the way that they've allowed monopolies to fester in environmental markets. It's true. Lina Khan, the current CEO of the FTC or whatever, is being super stringent on these things because she recognizes that the prior monopolization in energy industries has led to things like massive problems in Nigeria, which, for example, led to lawsuits that then Shell had to pay out, which screws over these countries. So they don't want to make the same mistakes that they did in the past. 3, it's a new industry, which is a thing for our side of the house, right, guys? The point is that monopolies take time to create. You have to build those market systems. You have to build export monopolization. You have to build technological monopolization. None of that has happened. And that means that when contracts come to you as a country on our side of the house, they don't come from just one actor. They come from 10 actors that all want to give you the best possible contract to make sure that you're taking it. The implication of this was massive, right? Because even if we give them their best case, if it's true that competition exists on our side of the house, then none of the harms that they talk about exist. It is not true that the contracts you get are predatory. It is not true that the types of things that are invested in you are actively harmful for you. Why? Because they want to make sure that you're taking their contract. There's not that many people that are able to mass export nickel, right? One country controls 40% of the nickel industry. And that means that one country is not willing to play ball with you, you can't fucking make your solar panels and you're screwed over as an industry. I think the other impact though, just to sort of, like burn CG a little bit, is that in the situation where they're not able to pursue these things, so like in this event that the companies are unable to, do these sorts of things, I think the West itself will in general be pretty pissed, right? And Dazzle points this out in his speech. He talks about how the other alternatives, if competition occurs in a way where they don't take these contracts, is just way worse things. It's the fact that you're gonna have to take out now loans from the West, but these loans are gonna be way worse for you because they want to punish you for the fact that you're not allowing for their companies to go in. It's the fact that, as happened with energy, from time and time again, they'll find really strange and odd ways to maybe even invade your country because they need those nickel resources because, quite frankly, oil is running out and we need to invest in green technology, right? So there's all these massive harms that come out from the fact that competition does exist, and on their side of the house, not taking these contracts is going to screw your country over in the long run. Why do we still win, even if competition doesn't exist? And from here on forward, I'll just assume we're dealing with natural monopolies. The first thing I want to do is deal with their comparative on nationalization and prove why it's so much worse on their side of the house. The first thing they say is cartelization is good for these countries. I think cartelization is really hard because there's 2 or 3 prerequisites that need to be met. First of all, you need to be a country that is capable of cartelizing with other countries. But oftentimes there's a collaboration problem that exists with other developing countries, specifically when it comes to the export of resources, because if it's such a competitive industry, and if your industry and economy is in such dire straits, and if by their own characterization you're a democracy and you want things like votes, all of those incentivize you to want to export things for a cheaper cost to these countries than other competitors, so that way you can corner the market. This leads to the race to the bottom that they said they wanted to avoid in a much more massive way on their side of the house, and cartelization never happens. Definitely not in the short run. Second, they say you can control the flow of the market, but I actually want to flip this on their head. Firstly, I think when you face crises, it is them that bear the cost. Because understand, panel, how specifically these contracts work on our side of the house, right? When a company comes to you and says, hey, we want to start up mining operations in your area, one of 2 things happens. You're either a country like Indonesia, where these operations exist to some extent, and you just continue on the contracts that you already had with these countries, but now just sell to green technology. I've already told you why the comparative is worse for independent reasons there. You don't want to piss off the people that you're already in good arms with. But in situations where these are genuinely fledgling areas where you're going to get genuinely good development, the companies are the ones that bear the startup costs, right? Which means that if there's crises within the market, which means that if there's fluctuations within the market, it is them that are screwed over, not you. At worst, I agree. This means that these companies may pull out temporarily, or that production may be worsened temporarily. But all the money that's made, for example, from the land costs, from the long-term contracts that they sign initially because they want to ensure that they have a sustainable flow of lithium into the long run, are still things that you can get on our side of the house. On their side, what happens is that because you're a national industry and you want things like votes that they themselves characterize, as was what happened in Venezuela, you rely as a government on things like clientelism, right? You give people money. You tell them, wow, we're making so much money from the sale of from the sale of this nickel, and we're doing so great. But when the economy eventually crumbles, all your voters turn out against you, and you end up with things like, at worst, revolution, at best, probably just really, really pissed off masses, and a really, really incapable government at literally everything else that matters in this world, right? So even when it came to economic crises, those were much worse on their side. Does closing have a POI?
OT has not yet claimed that green resources will actually be used for green causes and not just general causes that one.
Okay, but I think they're used for so I think they're used for general causes on either side of the house, right? Or else, where the fuck is all of Indonesia's nickel going? Like, already to general causes. The point is, the continuation of these contracts is a point we're winning on, right? When green technology is more sustainable and occurs more often, and so on and so forth. But we're also winning on the fact that green technology occurs in the long run. Lastly then, let me lay out the impacts that we've given you, because I don't think we're fourth. I don't think OG could prove that. Firstly, I think green technology is a very unique market, right? It's unlike other forms of just general energy production because it's the only energy production that we have in the future. It's one that's going to last a long time. It's one that has serious eagerness from the biggest actors in the world, and it's one that we see is going to have massive investment time and time again. We'd rather we err on the side of history where we're not punished because we didn't collaborate on their side of the house, and instead get all the benefits of sustainable development, of long-term growth, and of sustainable contracts that we know are always going to be good because green technology is always good. This weighs over everything they talk about, right? Because even at worst, if prices are low now, that still deals with the massive operational costs that we have to bear to enter this market that we can't on their side of the house. And also, even if it's true that the types of mining that are slightly worse on our side, if this is the only fucking form of energy that exists 100 years down the line, then we better be selling it or else we're so screwed. I'm incredibly proud to propose. Also, so I'm gonna leave this.
Thank you very much, Minister, because of the person with great technical help.
Apologies, a bag tried to sabotage me.
What, are you blaming my bag?
No, I'm blaming my bag. Saudi Arabia went from a desert with caravans of dervish to a sprawling kingdom full of wealth, full of high technology, full of the ability to control of the market because of the fact that they were able to nationalize their oil and sell it at their own terms rather than the terms enforced by the Western corporation. On the comparative, Ivory Coast has quadrupled its production and halved its GDP because of the fact that the West is controlling their exports at the fact that at the point where they privatized their exports and allowed the West to actually increase the efficiency. That efficiency did nothing for the actual economy, for the actual people on the ground. We prefer much more that the people on the ground actually get any of the access to the productivity that actually trickles down to them. This is the only this is only achievable at the point where the SOEs control that resources flow. Let's go into why opening government is unable to claim their debate. Number one, they assume that they have fiat, that you still control the resource expansion and resource sell on their side of the house. However, they don't contend with Lewandowski's mechanization about why those companies are unlikely to be actually willing to be giving you the control over the resource. But also, they concede themselves at PM that they are only going to be getting some of the resource at reduced prices compared to what everyone else is buying. This is realistic and this is true. This is exactly how Ivory Coast is being accessing their own mining resources that they are selling right now. The West is extracting them for them, and they don't have control over how much is extracted, how much is mined, and how much of those resources go to them and how much go to others. They can buy from the West, but they cannot get it themselves. They can tax the companies, but those companies have an army of lawyers that prevent those taxing to be effective. Three things here. Rents are much more extractable from SOEs because you have all of the infrastructure at home, but two, you have political people staffing the actual company itself, which means you have total control over the balance sheet. You see how much money they are making. Therefore, or you can tax them fairly, and you are able to extract the money from those companies and funnel it back into your economy. This is crucial for two reasons. Number one, because those states have incentives to cater to their people. This is true and this is knowledgeable because this is a democracy. Like those countries that we're talking about aren't like authoritarian regimes because of fact, again, as per the clarifications from day one from the CAs, we are debating within democracies. This is what they stated in the clarifications, which means that we are talking about people who have democratic incentives, which means that countries like Venezuela, like China, etc., those countries fall out. We are talking about countries like Mexico, like Argentina. At the very best, you can say that there's a limited scrutiny of civil society, but that civil society still exists. Now, let's talk about what the civil society does in terms of scrutinizing people and scrutinizing governmental interests. Civil society has a certain level of prioritization. E.g., those are not stupid people. Those are people who know where to hit and where to look. E.g., at the point where you have an SOE that is controlling half of your resource extraction and is like all of your manufacturing depends on that SOE actually funneling the resources and money into the other manufacturing industries in your country, you care about that one SOE a lot more than about all the other wings, which is why the corruption mechanism needed to have a lot more depth to be proven over this, because the people on the ground are able to scrutinize the corruption much more on our side of the house, because one, those people are dependent on the public buy-in, and they are dependent on the party in power actually stuffing those people in the SOE rather than an unaccountable market mechanism. The CEOs of mining companies can cause mudslides, and this is like a true thing. There is an American mining company CEO who caused 3 mudslides in all of his mines in developing countries and retained the CEO status for like 20 years until finally he fucked up in the US and he was removed in the US because the US only cares about its domestic interests for 3 reasons. Number 1, because people in America care about what they see in the news media. People in the news media are not going to write about yet another disaster in Africa or in Indonesia because this is just oversaturated market. Nobody cares. People don't really care about what happens in Indonesia. They care about what happens in their country. This is true, and you know this because you buy Nestle cereal or Nestle products, despite the fact that Nestle is committing horrible crimes and committing terrible experiments on African children. You know about this, you heard about this, but you don't care because you compartmentalize this. You think I am a good person despite the fact that I'm consuming Nestle products, despite the fact that I am doing this for 2 reasons, because you don't want to blame yourself, which is why you think, yeah, whatever, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. You just excuse yourself. But 2, you don't get to hear about this sometimes. So even if you hear about it, you don't care, but you probably also don't care about it because the media doesn't want to spotlight this. Therefore, backlash is dead in this debate, and I don't think that there's anything that CG can do it to bring it back from its grave because it's just factually incorrect. Nobody gives a shit about backlash. This is why SOEs are not able to, this is why SOEs are asymmetrically less able to do things like destroy environments, because again, they are accountable to the voting bloc, they are accountable to the civil society in their countries. This clearly destroys opening government because it shows you that A, you have better incentives, but 2, you have much more wealth coming into your country. Now let's talk about what this wealth does in this country, because this is crucial. And they give Venezuela as an example. And I think this is a great example for when you can actually, for what you can actually do for the people from oil money. Because note that the reason why Venezuela suffers right now is because of the massive devaluation of oil prices and because of the fact that they didn't sufficiently invest in things like green technology extraction. But Venezuela, at the point where oil prices were high and at the point where they were able to control the oil prices to some degree, were able to do things like that. They were able to create Mission Sucre, which revolutionized education system in Venezuela. For 20 years, Venezuela was the highest performing educationally state in Latin America. Even if in the long term, they were not able to have it last for like 50 years or something, this is still much better than Ivory Coast, where educational outcome collapsed, where healthcare outcomes collapsed, and that is the realistic comparative. E.g., if the state is incompetent, it's unlikely that they're going to be competent at managing the Western companies themselves, and they are not likely to be able to regulate them effectively, which is why the entirety of OGK is false. But closing, go for it.
So competition for resources doesn't just exist amongst the West only. China and Russia also want to compete for these resources. So if you don't let the West in willingly, what do you think happens next?
Okay. I'm assuming that CG case is going to be something like that. The global market is going to coerce you to let them in anyway, so might as well do it now. The problem is that if they are going to coerce you on either side of the house, then this debate doesn't exist. This debate exists in a world in which you have an option to either develop this on your side, on our side of the house, on their side of the house. If those countries are so weak that they are unable to resist any kind of diplomatic pressure, then there isn't a really good answer. But there's a second implication to this. If you are saying the West can force you into this, it's unlikely that they are going to give you good contracts. And in this situation, we win automatically, because if the West is coercive enough and powerful enough, combined with Russia and China, to actually force you into those contracts, That means two things: that this is bad for you, even if you're forced into it, we can still win on the fact that this is bad for you because they force you into bad contracts. And opening government already laid the seeds for their own demise here, because they explicitly concede that those contracts are going to, like, you are going to be forced into a certain contract. CG is planning to do the same thing, which is why we beat GovBench. Two pieces of weighing. Number one, people's welfare is the most important interest of the country, which is why having money coming in is more important than anything that CEO might provide on this kind of clash. But two, in terms of the actual ability of the states to funnel money, we have the best mechanisms here. What do we therefore claim? We claim that we have better control over the market, and therefore we can control how much resources are extracted. We have control over how long this bonanza of productivity is going to last, and we have control over what we do with the money. On the comparative, there is none of that. We win this debate.
So you would think, right, after the first time, you move it. I would think so. It's like, that's the typical incentive.
We thank the deputy leader of opposition to open up the second half of the debate, MG. We're very close together, guys. Lower voices, please.
Okay, all good? Look, I know all of us debaters hate when this gets brought up, but in this debate, it is actually true that if these countries don't let the West in willingly, they will have to let in China and Russia by force. This is genuinely what's going to happen, and a very, very important piece of context that OG crucially missed, because these countries cannot play ball with a Chinese corporation once they've come in to start mining your metals. Once, like Venezuela says, actually, we don't want to sell to you anymore, then the next thing you know, their port is gone, just like what happened in Sri Lanka. Notably, China is very, very able to get away with this, because it's not like the Chinese citizens are telling Xi Jinping not to do this. On the other hand, Facebook is very unlikely to go, like, invade an African country and drill for their minerals, like, illegally, because, like, Congress is very happy to put Mark Zuckerberg in front of them and question him, right? The American people are very, very happy to complain about what they're doing to the American government that is democratically accountable and elected, which these other nations are not. And they're very, very happy to be overly aggressive and violent towards these nations, which the West will never do because they don't have, like, the international standing to be able to get away with that. That's what OG missed, and that's the first part that I needed to fill in. Okay. After that, then, what are the incentives of these resource-rich nations, and what is the most important things to them? Three things here. First, we think the first thing that these countries care about is sustainable growth, because notably we've, like, conceded throughout this debate that resources are finite, right? So they need to be able to have some level of sustainable growth, even though their resource, like, level is unsustainable. Second, they want to largely expand their resource markets, because for a lot of these countries, like, their resources are the only things that they're able, like, to offer on the world trading stage, and, like, they need to be able to sell to more people to get richer. I think that's pretty intuitive. But third, these countries overall, probably to a degree, want to have more autonomy over their resources than they do right now. We think the West is able to do a much better job of giving them that. Let me go through these three things in turn and explain to you crucially why the West gives so many more benefits to these companies, things that are opening crucially missed. Okay, first, on sustainable growth. We heard some stuff from opening about, like, job creation and things like this, but crucially, they missed the most important ways in which these resource nations actually profit from these companies coming in. Because these contracts aren't just, we'll give you $1 million, we can mine in your country for 6 months. The contracts are, we'll come into your country, we'll mine these resources, we'll sell them to green tech companies in your markets, and for every solar panel we sell, you get 5% of the profit because it's your metal that it's made from. This is the crucial way that these countries actually make the money out of this, like, supply chain, and so they're able to actually play ball with these corporations and say, we want XYZ amount of, like, the profit that comes out of these materials, that comes out of these technologies, etc. Yeah, go for it.
We agree that China will enter. We think that China is great, both for fighting climate change, both for building more infrastructure, both for fighting corruption and increasing competition.
Okay, pro-China, fine. Okay, fair enough. I mean, I think, like, this is a dangerous game to play, right? China has no problem being incredibly pervasive in these nations, as we've seen in the past many, many times, like, more than willing to block trade routes, more than willing to take ports away, more than willing to import their own workers into those countries and refuse to give locals jobs. So I think if that's your extension, I'd rethink that in the 5 minutes you've got left. The next thing I'd move on to then is that the country's image, I think, if they say that you're a very, very resource-rich nation who now allows like Meta to come in and mine for lithium batteries or whatever they want, I think the more that these nations are able to cement themselves in the supply chain and show themselves as a crucial actor to be able to supply these metals and materials for this green tech, which government bench has already proved is the future, then I think that these countries are able to like cement themselves on the world stage as an actor that actually matters, right? In a way that they're not able to do so right now. Crucially, the reason why they have to let the West in to be able to do this is because huge Western companies, like green tech, backed by these like massive VC firms that we've heard from opening, right? They have access to global markets that these small resources-rich nations often do not. They're simply unable to access like the Western market or even like the European market in the way that a company like Google would. And so in those contract negotiations where they say, we'll give Google like X percentage of our mining space if we're able to get like a 5% profit off of every lithium battery that they sell, that's the point at which we're able to create this actual sustainable growth in these countries, because the amount of money they get from their resources are able to build them up to the point in which they can like focus on other industries that aren't their resources, which are slowly dwindling away, right? That's how we achieve their interest of sustainable growth, and we've proved that this is actually like the primary interest of these resource-rich nations, right? And I think CG is the only that's able to prove that we get sustainable growth over time. Yeah, I'll take it.
The only way that you can funnel those resources into manufacturing if you have control over them. The one will prove that you are capable of running those SOEs well.
Yeah.
You are not going to prove that you are not capable because
Yeah,
you're not
fine.
doing his mechanisms.
Okay, where are you going to get more control over your resources? If you're playing ball with Google or if you're playing ball with Xi Jinping? I think you're much more able to get a lot more of your say and leeway in your contracts if you're playing ball with a democratically like accountable country, because these Western companies are backed by Western countries. Like obviously the US wants Facebook to make money because that's money coming into California and going into the rest of the country. That's why they want these companies to like do well and not be horrifically unethical, because then people will like stop purchasing their products and stop working with them. I think that even if it's true that like these countries lose a degree of their autonomy over their resources by interacting with the West, they are much more likely to have more autonomy in the contracts that they're having than if they allowed another actor inside. And realistically, right? The alternative is not nationalization, because that's impossible. These countries do not have the technology to do that, and I don't think opposition has ever proven to us why suddenly Venezuela is going to have like the insane mining tools to come up with their own lithium batteries, right? That's not going to happen. So the alternative isn't nationalization, it's selling to a worse actor. The whole point is the West is like the most likely to be nice to these countries, right? In the simplest way possible, and the most likely to allow them to get the most profit out of their contracts. We've proven to you uniquely the way that these companies benefit, right? Because these companies have access to global markets that these countries do not, something that our opening missed. They also missed the fact that they get a piece of the profit from every piece of technology that is like created within their country with the jobs that are created there. I think once again, like China has no problem exporting their workers into like these developing nations and having them do the mining jobs instead of the locals, right? That's something that a Western country is never going to do. And I think it's just much safer to play ball with them than to risk having like your ports taken away.
Okay, panel, are you ready? For the recording, like, I mean, okay, I'm well audible. Right. I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1, and you heard the extension. China is good. 3 reasons for that. First of all, climate change. Second of all, dual power mechanisms, less corruption, more competition. Thirdly, more infrastructure being built. But before that, let's just frame why the China case is likely and consistent with the opening opposition that countries are going to nationalize the thing. First of all, note, even if you were nationalizing it, you still need investment in order to build more things, and you need more capital. Note, Western investment is very connected to Western companies. Because A, all of the big investment are also connected to Western companies, trust the most due to their good track record. B, because they oftentimes have share in Western companies and the such. so they don't let you get the money. Whereas China is now trying to make new investment, they're far more willing to take risky and support your own companies. So it's likely that if you're not taking Western investment, you're taking Chinese investment on their deals. Number two, infrastructure. Note, if you're also entering with a company, you also need to build the infrastructure around that. If you need a company to build the infrastructure, these companies, even if in the past developed resources, they're not good at developing infrastructure because, third world infrastructure sucks. So they need to bring in someone else. Western companies don't want to just randomly enter in for infrastructure. It's usually connected. When they enter, they don't trust the state to build it. They want stuff like that. So they don't trust the state or China because states oftentimes corrupt. They want direct control and monopolization of the infrastructure. Whereas oftentimes China is more willing to go in to let you build that infrastructure alongside your local companies. So we get Chinese infrastructure. Lastly, it's likely that all of these deals also pivot the resources towards Chinese manufacturing, Chinese areas. Even if it's done locally, it's done in cooperation with Chinese companies. Why is that true? Because all Chinese companies are basically one entity. You need a CCP member in all of the companies. So oftentimes a lot of the investment deals also help in other companies that the Chinese state wants to invest in, such as infrastructure, such as and other areas. Why is all of this very important? First of all, climate change. Note that China is the current dominant actor in terms of climate technology in the world and green technology. This is very important. The majority of electrical vehicles being produced are from China. The majority of solar panels being produced are from China, stuff like that. Why is this structurally true? First, why is China producing all of these things? Number one, China has state control, so it could have pivoted a lot faster to these industries, right? It could have put in a lot more money in them, subsidies, forced investors to invest in them, stuff like that, forced cooperation in these, so it could have pivoted a lot faster to them. Second of all, they're simply just lagged behind all other industries. Note, the West in most high-tech industries has been dominant over China for years, right? Computing and everything else. This means that at the point at which there was a new emerging industry, climate change, China jumped on it very, very, very quickly, right? Green technology and stuff like that. China's invested in it massively, unlike the West. Why is it unlike the West? First of all, Western investors suck. Number one, they invest in other areas as well. That is to say, they don't all invest in the green technology. There's a lot of other areas where the West is superior, computing and such, so they didn't invest in green technologies. Number two, they also invest in China, right? There's a large liquidity pool in terms of doing that. So Western investors have oftentimes invested in China instead of the West when it came to green technology, right? BlackRock has a lot of stock in all of these areas and the such. Importantly here, second of all, the states are simply just stuck in terms of providing subsidization and the such. First of all, because they're democratic capitalist states, they put in less subsidies, less regulations and the such. Inherently, they have less capacity. But second of all, these subsidies are less long term, right? Trump could win has more than 50% chance to win in a couple of months, and then he would cancel them all. So people rely on them far less and are far less willing to act with them. Why is all of this so important? The governments have fiat to say these are green resources, mined for that are mined, but they don't have fiat to say that they go towards green areas. Importantly, when China is leading the manufacturing of green areas and the such, and you go and you bring your resources in Chinese concentrated areas, you develop them a lot more in green manufacturing. When you move them a lot to the West, to Western companies that have connections with more Western manufacturers and the such, you move them more towards non-green manufacturing. Why is all of this crucial? Because at the point at which you get more resources in these areas, you get more production of the goods, which lowers prices and increases the consumption of these goods. So we get that more non-green goods are being produced at the point which is done in the West, and there is less transition because the prices of these goods are now cheaper. This applies bi-directionally because on our side we get cheaper goods from China that happen, we get more of them entering the market and such. But also know that since this motion applies to all countries that apply, this is also a massive extent from that area, right? Because now all countries are moving to the West, all countries are allowing the West to enter, and therefore this also applies to a large amount of resources. Why is all of this important? Because we prevent access to green technology, we just waste resources in manufacturing of that. It increases climate change because of the manufacturing cost, blah, blah, blah. Climate change is very, very, very bad. Why is climate change bad? Number one, it's probably the biggest impact in this debate in terms of the fact that it kills people, ruins that, right? Natural disasters, droughts, stuff like that. These countries, these developing countries oftentimes have large agricultural sectors, are very susceptible to these disasters. This is a huge impact on them. Number two, this is an impact on the poorest people of the country, right? Oftentimes these are the people who rely on agriculture and stuff like that and have the least ability to go against it. So they massively die, massively harm. Number three, this is for the long term. All of the other cases in the room are relatively short term, right? These countries are right now corrupt. What's going to happen in the short term? But climate change is going to stay with us for the 100 years, 200 years, even if these countries modernize, fix their corruption problems, whatever else happens, at the point which we accelerate and prevent move to green technology, probably the biggest impact in the debate. Before I'm going to continue opening.
We have a world with more actors such as the West and China, which increases competition and better contracts, because the motion is about allowing the choice. This case doesn't actually oppose the motion, which is never allowing the West to.
No, I think that the motion is not about allowing the choice. It's about moving the Western companies in, right? This is how it's been debated up until now. I also think that this is what the motion literally is phrased within it, that it's in their interest to move in Western companies. If it's in your interest to move them, you're probably moving them more over the side where it's not your interest to move them in. Second of all, competition and dual power mechanisms. On two levels. Number one, dual power mechanisms between China and these local companies. Note, on their side, Western companies do the entire job. On our side, you need to have the local companies that also get investment from China. Why is that important? China and Western and the local companies have an incentive to check each other. None of them want the other to embezzle, none of them want the other to be corrupt, right? So the agreements that they sign usually have anti-corruption mechanisms from both sides because nobody wants them to be corrupt. And they also check up on each other, right? They constantly check up that the agreements happen. They constantly test whether or not the other one is corrupt, embezzling money, check their funds, stuff like that. Why is all of this important? Because these are simply far stronger checkup mechanisms than the rest of the room. China and the companies have more resources than the rest of the room to check one another, and we are far closer, right? I think the strongest anti-competition and the strongest corruption argument in this debate has been the democratic checkup argument from opening opposition, which is still way the fuck weaker than all of that. Second of all, dual power competition against the West. Note, the West has been the entrenched power in these areas for a long time, both because of colonialism, which means that all of the resource companies have moved to their traditionally enough say there, and both because of the fact that the past expertise and the fact that the West was more dominant in manufacturing like a few decades ago. Importantly, this means that we literally just increase competition at the point at which we move China. Yael is going to rebut more the opening government mechanism of why competition exists in the West. I don't think it exists, but irrelevant to that, we simply move more actors in. Note, China cannot be coercive. China knows it's the weaker actor in this thing. It has been the one that's traditionally been weaker, has less contacts, has less ability in order to enter. I don't fucking know why the fact that the United States is a democracy means that it doesn't have check and mechanism. Reality check, all of the CIA coups ever, right? The fact that you're democratic doesn't mean you're non-corrupt, but the fact that you're a weaker actor, the fact that you've moved in less, probably means you're likely to be less corrupt and be less likely in order to do that. So both on checking China and that, and both on checking China versus the West, I think that we get less corruption, more check mechanisms, the countries can demand more stuff like that. So power to oppose.
Just for the It's funny because I'm from Sri Lanka. You'll see it later. Yeah? Let's take top half of the debate real quickly, and I think we're going to do this by just out-characterizing them from this debate. They miss a very crucial thing about this debate, which is essentially that if the West doesn't come in, the possibility of nationalization exists. That's just untrue. I don't think if the West doesn't come in, that possibility even exists in the first place. That's not going to happen, because the second you start nationalization, which is like a 2, 3, maybe 10-year process, China is going to come in. Why? There's been a constant race for resources between China and West for like the last 30, 40 years. On top of that, China also needs resources for minerals, for things that they're producing, things like microwaves, things like semiconductors, which also they can extract from these, which they are the largest producer in the world for. So it's not just green technology, but other things that they can use this sort of minerals and resources for that they also currently need. But on top of that, as CEO quite rightly pointed out, they have also made massive investments into green technology as well. It's part of the market that they haven't dominated, but it's something that they would dominate if they knew that the West was not going into these areas. So the second that they say, oh, that the West isn't in these areas, that actually have these resources that can produce these materials, they are likely to go in. That's the first bit of reasoning that takes top half. The second is, note crucially, that the BRI started in 2013. What that means is, China has been on a race for capturing a lot of people, a lot of countries along the Belt and Road, along the Silk Route, which runs across the entirety of the world, to access these resources and create a global link, or a global link route or a production route amongst these nations. So that means China has constantly had this incentive since 2013 to go into these countries in the first place, right? So that's two very crucial pieces of information that I think you should know. What this means is, China is definitely going to come in, right? It's literally their foreign policy since 2013 to come in and get resources. That is the BRI, that is the Belt and Road Initiative. But on top of that, they need these resources. Why is that a very, very bad thing? So this is now we're going to directly engage with CEO. So their case is essentially China very good because of things like the infrastructure and subsidies that you otherwise would not get from the West. I'm going to be comparative here, but before that, I want to give 4 extraneous responses to this. Firstly, I don't think China has as much money as they claim to have in order to subsidize for many reasons. reasons. One, the BRI is a global, worldwide infrastructure project, which means they've spent half their fucking money already on Africa, another half on Asia, a lot of money in other areas. I don't know why they have surplus of money to spend particularly here and subsidize it. That's a matter of proof, a matter of analysis that they did not give us enough on, so I don't really think of. But secondly, there's absolutely no accountability mechanism in terms of voting. The fact that there's an autocratic leader in power means that no matter what the citizens want, they can't make any sort of change here. And this is, it's been a bit of a wash on top half whether or not people actually care about climate change. I would say they do. The reason is, as of recent, people have started dying because of climate change. People have actually lost their lives. People in Japan lost their lives, people in Sri Lanka lost their lives, people in Thailand lost their lives within the last decade because of climate change. So when it comes to you being, it's become a more proximate issue to say. For that reason, I think people really do care about things like climate change. And these accountability mechanisms only exist in places that are democratic, like the United States of America, where they can actually vote people in power and vote people out of power for their own proximate needs. Because you're like, shit, I don't want to be killed by an earthquake. I might vote on it, which is why you've seen an increasing trend of people actually caring about things like climate change when it comes to voting. But third, note crucially that China is constantly being sanctioned. The fact that they've been sanctioned by the UN like 7 times, been removed from the UN so many times, been sanctioned by so many international institutions, sanctioned by the World Trade Organization, sanctioned by had a trade war with the United States of America. On top of that, you have a switch to the Republican Party happening in the United States of America very recently as well, which means a continuation of the probable trade war that's going to happen with China once again. I don't think they're as like powerful or as strong as they say in terms of being able to provide subsidies and provide infrastructure. They're under so many financial constraints. I don't think they're going to be able to do as good a job as as CGCO claims to say. Fourth and final response is China is just one actor. Under our side, the West is multiple actors. Okay, fine, the UK fucks up. You still have the US to turn to. The US fucks up. Fine, you have France to turn to, which can also extract your resources and give you contracts. The fact that there's optionality on our side of the house means you're likely to get better deals and less exploitation because you have multiple actors to turn to. When China comes in and just does what it wants, I think that is seriously problematic. Before you say, oh wait, they don't just enter into countries without consent, yes, they do. I'm from Sri Lanka. Trust me, they pull up on ships and they do come. I think there's reasons for this, which I gave. They have incentives to do this, but on top of that, they have capacity by virtue of being an autocracy, which means they're not accountable to anyone, but they also have the resources in terms of like the manpower against these smaller countries. So China will come in, can come in, has come in, and this is very, very bad. Before I move on, I'll take opening if you have anything. Oh, I'm sorry, closing if you have anything.
We think that the fact that the BRI is global doesn't mean that we don't have money for specific investments in specific companies that have the resources that we
Whoa. This isn't a planned investment, okay? You can't say that this is a planned investment. This is, by virtue of the motion, it's by virtue of the US not coming into these countries that China would come in. You can't say it's been a long-standing plan. It is a long-standing plan policy that the BRI needs to be connected at a specific point, which they're already struggling to pay, by the way. Just note that they've already struggled to pay back African countries, already struggled to pay back Asian countries. I don't think you can just say that they have like infinite resources. That's just untrue. Okay, so that's the first thing. I think that deals with a lot of CG's material. Where is it comparative and where do we come in here? We think, which also proves why nationalization doesn't work. So before I move on to the comparative, actually I'll engage with that a bit more extraneously because I think there is some credit to be given in terms of the possibility of nationalization. But I just think comparatively you'd have a better option on our side of the house for 3 reasons. Firstly, historically, these countries haven't been able to access the same markets that the West has. So even if you do nationalize these services, you still won't have access to the new markets that you would have on our side of the house. Note crucially that in order for this nationalized system to work, you still need to turn in a certain amount of money every single year. If not, you have to fund in from other sectors. So the thing they said on crop subsidization actually works against them. To the point we prove that these things aren't going to be as efficient as the West, it means you're actually going to have to take money out of other sectors and actually fund it into this. So the quality of life of people under OGs, no, I'm not taking you. The quality of life of people under this, that's significantly worse, I think, on their side of the house. But secondly, they needed to answer this thing on technology. No one really understands how mining technology works, but I'll explain it right now. Mining technology is essentially when you extract it, there's a way to extract the most efficient amount of resources. If you do it by hand, sometimes some of them fall down or some of them aren't extracted in a way that they can be used. They can break and whatever. Technology allows you to mine more of that more efficiently. That is essentially what you get on our side of the house. You get more resources. This translates to massive benefits, not just that you have more of your resource, but also the fact that you can sell it to newer markets and sell it at better rates and get more money. But thirdly, and there's a third benefit that Dia brings to you, on our side of the house, I think employment is a lot safer for the reasons that when these people come in, they come in with their infrastructure, with their technology, which actually ensures that their workers do work efficiently. These are things that you would not have on that side of the house if it was nationalized, because they don't have the money to ensure the safety of these workers. I think on that side of the house, exploitation gets worse. So even if you take nationalization at its very best, I still don't think it stands. Finally, let's staying on like media companies and the accountability that media companies can. Dia dealt with this fairly enough, but I think so I'm not going to run into it because I'm past them, but I think the crux of this essentially is you have to consider the fact that worse actors are going to come in, and the best actor that you can rely on is the one you need to take in now. Easy CG win.
We think the whip, to close out the debate of whip. Can I use this as well? Thank you. Sorry. Okay, panel ready? Yeah. Okay, amazing. Cool. Firstly, rebutting CG. So firstly, they say, oh, China will do that illegally. I don't think this is the likely case. I don't understand how this is. This is an assertion. Secondly, I think that that when China does care, it is better, right? When China care about you, they have more interest for you, so they want to do better things for you. They want to veto for you, and you can have leverage power over them when they have something to gain from you. Secondly, about this 5% with every purchase, this seems like an influencer extension. Firstly, I don't understand why is this something that gives me leverage power, right? The fact that I have 5% of every purchase, I just don't understand. Secondly, why is this a slow growth? I don't see that, right? If I get a 5% out of every purchase, I still think this is lots of money for many countries. I still think countries, as much as I don't want a very a problematic investment, this is something that would be very big for them. And I don't get why the fact that it is 5% is the one that is the tipping point for this debate. Thirdly, they try to explain to us why China is bad later. They say many things, but I will respond now. Firstly, China is bad because Xi Jinping is an autocratic leader. Firstly, why is this relevant? If anything, this is good because it means that the investments are better, they are more long-term, you can rely on them more because we know that they have the ability to keep their promise. Secondly, because they will take our port, it was assertive. I don't understand this. I think it is some specific example that I don't know. In Israel, they didn't take our port, even though they have investment for us. Thirdly, Guy talks to you about why China is good. So firstly, Guy tells you, listen, the biggest incentive of a country to invest in those areas is for China. Why? Because most of the manufacturing happens in China. Now, I know this is spec, but we are all with case files, right? I can tell you 80% of the solar panel manufacturing is from China. Most of EV manufacturing is from China. In the United States, in comparison, the situation is much worse. Why? Firstly, because Trump, that is likely to be the next president is actively against green technologies, because even with Biden administration, EVs and generally fields that China will dominate were strictly cut down. And thirdly, I think that overall actors that they said, like French, I simply don't understand why this is true. Notice that in the West we have a very strong lobbyism power of traditional industries that are much more polluting. And so I don't understand why in their world the West would be better. I feel like this room tries to run on intuitions that a panel may have, that the West is better than China. But in this specific instance in which we need to manufacture green technologies, the West isn't better than China, the West is worse. Thirdly, about BRI, I think that this is a very weird argument. I think the BRI also gives money back, right? This is an investment, this is something that is profitable. This is not the reason why China will collapse. There were no reasons given us to why China is not reliable financially. The second thing that Guy talks to you is that simply the Western investors are bad, and he talks about firstly why they are less long-termistic with actors like Trump, Biden, and with the fact that the Western market is more volatile, but secondly how they are less stable, which is crucial specifically for those countries that need a constant stream of income that they can rely on, they can promote their country on. But third thing they say is that, oh, in your side you can only choose China, in our side you can choose both. Guy actually analyzed that. Guy talked to you about the unfair advantage that Western actors have, specifically in places like Indonesia, specifically in places like post-colonial countries. How, when the West have this advantage right now, it is much more able to take advantage of those countries, to exploit them, etc. China, by being a new actor, is much less likely to do so, much more likely to challenge the West. Here we think that the West is the wrong actor and that China is a much better actor. Why is this important in this debate? Firstly, on the environmental clash, we think that up until our point, the contributions there have been non-comparative. Why? Because on both sides there is an agreement that the natural resources would be extracted. Why Guy breaks its deadlocks? Because Guy talks to you about why the fact that those resources will actually go to green production, because China uniquely is the manufacturer, and so if it produces, it is for those green industries that were later on sold to the rest of the world. Meaning that Guy clearly breaks the deadlock and give you the unique mechanism here. But secondly, CG says, oh, they will invest because they don't want to die. Firstly, you have Trump, you have the MAGA movement that really don't care about environmental things. Secondly, we think that international legislation is very vague many of the time, and so it is ineffective. And thirdly, it takes lots of time for environmental movement to wake up. We think that most of the world are not debaters and don't have this awareness like you have. Closing.
So I will concede that China probably makes better solar panels, but my point is that they'll exploit the people who are working in that process and give this country less money.
Listen, if we have more solar panels, if we have more money to the country, if the country on both sides is unable to profit from those companies, in our world at least we are able to help those countries environmentally, which is a much more important benefit, because it is long lasting, because if we reach the point of no return we have no way to come back of it, and because if we don't have these environmental gains right now, this is something that is less likely to happen in the future, and so less reversibility. Simply, we just think that dying because of climate change is much more close than suffering under some maybe uncertain pollution. But thirdly, we think that because the West has no checkup mechanisms, there is no guarantee that the West won't exploit. See the example of Nike. OG. Firstly, we think that they never proved to us that there are international scrutiny. This is an assertion. Like we said, environmental legislation is vague most of the time, unbinding, and so we don't understand why there is a checkup mechanism. Secondly, most of their analysis about why companies are good is about the fact that this market is very profitable. Firstly, like I said, many green technologies are falling today because of Trump, because of Biden crack down, etc. And secondly, the fact that you have money doesn't mean that you have competition. On OO, notice, I think that they are very, like the comparative of them is very weird, right? The low-hanging fruit they talk about with their local SOEs have already been extracted. Guys talks to you about why you need investment, you need infrastructure and experience, and this is uniquely something that Western or Chinese companies have, and the local companies specifically cannot do. We call you to oppose.